Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we're going to be discussing circadian rhythms and human health. And as always, if you're listening to the recording, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're watching this. My name is Alex Manos. I am one of the co-founders here at Health Path, and my background is in nutritional therapy and functional medicine. And really, I must admit, it's been maybe the last 6 months where I've developed a real interest in circadian rhythms, circadian biology, and really our intimate connection with the natural laws and with nature, and how if we can reconnect with some of those things, we really can have a significant impact on our overall health. So the objectives of today are very simple. We're going to introduce these concepts around circadian rhythms, circadian biology, circadian medicine, and we're going to finish off by taking that sort of theory ultimately and discussing what can we do in our day-to-day lives to improve our circadian rhythm, which, as you'll see, is going to have a ripple effect in most areas of our physiological, psychological, and arguably also emotional health. So if we start from a blank canvas, we obviously need to consider, well, what is our circadian rhythm or a circadian rhythm? And it's really referring to the fact that we run on approximately a 24-hour clock, and that various cycles in our physiology are calibrated, are entrained within that 24-hour period. And it's been kind of hypothesized really that this circadian rhythm evolved over time to help our behavior and our physiology. So we were able to predict that certain physiological processes needed to sort of kick in, needed to come into action, so to speak, at certain times of the day. And you can see here, this is a paper published in the medical journal Nature Medicine, and it shows you that we also understand that, generally speaking, in certainly a healthy individual, there are certain times in the day where certain physiological and psychological processes peak, shall we say. So lipid levels peak around 6 p.m., for example. Cortisol secretion, one of those stress hormones, really starts to kick in around 6 a.m. Insulin secretion around the first meal between 7 and 8 a.m. We have elevated testosterone levels around 9. So we have various biological or physiological processes that in the ideal world are governed partly by the light-dark spectrum. And this is what people refer to as Zeitgebers, sort of environmental stimuli that help entrain our circadian rhythm. And you can see in this visual, they talk, or the authors of this paper talk about photic and non-photic Zeitgebers. These are essentially related to light or not related to light. The most powerful environmental stimuli for a healthy circadian rhythm is light. And therefore, any webinar that touches on circadian rhythms is really a webinar touching on the role that light plays within human health. Light is going to obviously go through the eye. It's going to a part of the brain called the SCN in our hypothalamus. And this is referred to as our master clock. So we have a master clock in the brain, and we have peripheral clocks really in every single cell, gland, organ, and tissue in the body. And these two, the master clocks and our peripheral clocks, ideally need to obviously be synchronized, and they're partly synchronized, mainly synchronized via light. We do have other environmental stimuli though. That can be the sleep-wake cycle, which doesn't obviously always correlate with the light-dark cycle. Physical activity, social time, socializing, and meals, or the time at which we eat, are all environmental stimuli that also can impact positively or negatively our circadian rhythm. So throughout today's presentation, I've actually just added a few quotes that I've used previously, basically in social media, hence they come with some images as well. So since antiquity, we have known that the doctor's presence is needed where the sun is missing. One of the things I really want to emphasize in today's webinar is the importance of exposing ourselves to sunlight on a daily basis. And even in the UK, where obviously I am based and many of you are based, there's a question around, but we don't get that much sun, or what happens when it's really cloudy for an extended period of time. We're still getting sunlight. So that sunlight is still going through our eyes. It's still landing and penetrating our skin. And we're still going to get numerous health benefits associated with sun exposure. So one of the most powerful ways we can improve or maintain good circadian rhythm is respecting that light-dark cycle, as we shall see. But we have a fundamental problem in the modern world. 90% of our time, according to some research, is spent indoors, mainly at home or in the workplace. And this is actually, from an evolutionary perspective, quite a new behavior for us as a society. And I think we're only just starting to understand the impact this is having on our health over the recent years. So if we already now appreciate the importance of sun and light, ideally natural light, as a way to keep a healthy circadian rhythm, but fundamentally most of us are not getting enough of that environmental stimulus. So let's look at some of the research quickly around the importance of sunlight. We now know from the Environmental Research and Public Health Journal that insufficient sun exposure is a significant public health problem. Studies in the past decade indicate that insufficient sun exposure may be responsible for 340,000 deaths in the United States and almost 500,000 in Europe, with an increased incidence of breast cancer, colorectal cancer, hypertension, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, things like obesity and type 2 diabetes, but also neurodegenerative sort of conditions such as Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, autism, asthma, type 1 diabetes, myopia, and actually many other autoimmune-based conditions have been discussed now in the research as being correlated with, for example, the latitude at which we live and the amount of sunshine that we are being exposed to. In Europe, the risk of skin cancer is mainly caused by an intermittent pattern of exposure. Regular exposure confers a relatively low risk and may actually, some will argue, be protective. So again, it's not necessarily the sun per se, but the relationship that many of us have with the sun. We spend 90% of our time indoors. We get to the summer and then we spend suddenly 8 hours outside just in our swimming trunks, and we experience sunburn, which is problematic. So one of the best recommendations that we can give is to really focus on getting more sun exposure as we go through the late stages of winter into spring. So we're conditioning ourselves to reduce that risk of sunburn, but also to ensure that we're actually maximizing our exposure to sunlight. We can take this one step further. So we have circadian rhythms, this approximate 24-hour body clock. And I say approximate because it isn't exact. And that is one of the reasons why it's so important that we consider our light environment and our light exposure, and why it's so important for us to consider the timing at which we eat, potentially when we exercise and these sorts of things. But we also have circannual rhythms. These are kind of seasonal rhythms in our physiology. And as soon as we truly start to sort of reflect and understand how connected we are with nature and with the seasons, we can start to understand how things are going to oscillate seasonally as well. Until very recently, we would only had food that was grown locally and in season, for example. So our food supply has significantly changed. When you look at the research around circannual rhythms, you, for example, will find this paper, the American Journal of Gastroenterology, With this quote, subjects with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, were significantly more likely to report seasonal changes in pain. We see things from a cardiometabolic perspective as well. Cardiac mortality significantly increases by 22% and 31% in Norwegian and Irish men, and 24% and 39% in Norwegian and Irish women in the winter compared to summer. Cholesterol levels, blood pressure levels, they oscillate with the seasons. Cortisol levels, serotonin levels, melatonin levels, vitamin D levels, these all oscillate dependent on what season we're in, because there should be a correlation between the season and the amount of sunshine that we are going to receive or experience. So look at all of the conditions associated with circadian dysfunction, everything from irritable bowel syndrome to autoimmune gastrointestinal conditions like inflammatory bowel disease. We've listed various cancers that are associated with a lack of sun exposure, and therefore you could argue partly related to circadian dysfunction. Metabolic disease, neurodegenerative conditions, bipolar disorder, depression, various autoimmune conditions, and as we'll see, even leaky gut or intestinal permeability has been associated with dysregulated circadian rhythms. So for those of you with chronic digestive issues, really focusing on a healthy circadian rhythm is actually going to be one of the foundational things that we can do to optimize gut health, but also systemic health. So we've really already mentioned various cancers that have been associated with sunlight exposure. It was thought that vitamin D was the primary explanation for this, and it's still generally, I guess, the common knowledge, which is sunshine is going to allow synthesis of vitamin D in the body. However, there are many other things that we now know about sunshine when it's allowed to penetrate our skin. And that is, for example, the formation of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a gas, it's a vasodilator. So it's dilating the blood vessels. And it's thought this is one of the reasons whereby things like blood pressure and cardiovascular disease drops when we have appropriate amounts of sunshine. There's a research paper that came out recently discussing the role that sunshine plays in heart health. And again, one of those mechanisms was related to nitric oxide. But melatonin, many of us know melatonin as the sleep hormone, but it's also one of the most potent antioxidants in the human body. And if you're not experiencing darkness, like so many of us aren't in the modern world, you are having a negative impact on your melatonin production and therefore your immunity. Melatonin in supplement form has been found to be incredibly effective at improving gut health and the condition of IBS. If you're being exposed to blue light, the light that's emitted from most of our technology, your phone, your tablets, your computer, your TV, or just your bedside lamp, for example, that blue light has been shown to inhibit melatonin production, having an impact on your sleep, contributing to dysregulated circadian rhythms that's going to impact all of these different sorts of health conditions. So some will say that this epidemic that we're experiencing from a health perspective in the modern world, whether that's related to increasing numbers of neurodegenerative conditions or autoimmune disease or obesity or diabetes, yes, the nutrition plays a bit of a role. Yes, our sedentary lifestyles play a bit of a role, but is one of the biggest ones the fact that we now spend 90% of our day inside. And just as one example of a paper that you can find if you go and do this research, and this came out in the year 2001. So this research is not necessarily new, but natural sunlight can be an underestimated and uncontrolled light therapy for bipolar depression. We actually see various studies showing us that those in a hospital setting who are in a room that has more exposure to sunlight, especially in the morning, so if it's an east-facing room, leave hospital quicker than those staying in a room that is west looking, where they're not getting that morning sunshine. And we'll touch on why the morning is particularly important in a little bit as well. So this is just some of the evidence showing us how important it is to get some morning sunshine, and sunshine full stop, ultimately. What's really important to also appreciate is it is bidirectional. So if you have various conditions or imbalances within your physiology, it is also more likely that you'll have a dysregulated circadian rhythm. A lot of people with chronic gut issues, for example, have issues with sleep. They wake 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times a night. And having had chronic gut issues myself, it's very obvious that even if you're just struggling with bloating, that feeling of just discomfort is enough to impact the quality of sleep that you're going to have. But all of these conditions are bidirectional with circadian dysfunction. So we don't want to just focus on our sunlight exposure. We want to be doing all of these other things to support our health as well. But it is one of the most important and fundamental elements of any health program, I would argue. And again, really to emphasize this point of how important it is, we now know that in humans, circadian rhythm, so our 24-hour body clock, helps regulate blood sugar levels, insulin, one of the hormones that regulates our blood sugar levels and therefore our glucose tolerance, lipid levels, things like cholesterol and triglycerides, our energy expenditure. So we're now thinking also about body composition and weight, and appetite. So this is a segue into the concept that not only is light incredibly important to entrain that circadian rhythm, but the time of day that we consume our food is arguably the second most important environmental stimulus that we can manage, we can consider as a way to optimize these things. So a paper that looked at meal timing and frequency and the implications of these two things on cardiovascular disease prevention stated that a greater distribution of our food intake, our calorie intake in the evening, irregular or erratic meal patterns, increased frequency of eating occasions, and extended duration of daily eating periods may all contribute to cardiometabolic disease. So to put this in simple terms, if you're eating throughout the day, compared to, let's say, 2 or 3 meals a day, if you're eating from early on till late into the night, so let's say breakfast is at 6:30 and you have a snack at 9:30, 10 o'clock before bed, just as an example. If you have a really light breakfast and a really big dinner, let's say at 8 p.m., these things are not conducive to good cardiometabolic health, compared to if you basically do the opposite. You focus on primarily 2 or 3 meals per day and you avoid snacking or grazing. If you limit the time period of which you are consuming your food, so maybe breakfast is as late as it can be, whatever that may be, 8 o'clock, and maybe you try and have an earlier dinner. I appreciate when we're working 9 to 5s, which sometimes are 8 to 6, these kind of things can be quite tricky. So we can only do what we can do that's within our control, if that makes sense. But trying to have dinner as soon as you can when you get back home, for example, making it the smallest meal of the day, trying to bring in a big, healthy breakfast if possible. So you're doing the best that you can from these parameters. It really can make a difference to cardiometabolic health, and cardiometabolic health is also foundational to most other areas of health as well. Now, many of you and our customers obviously are dealing with chronic gut conditions and symptoms. So I did want to focus a little bit in on this as well and share some of the research and some quotes that I thought were quite powerful in regards to this. So this was a paper published in Frontiers in Neuroscience, and the authors discussed how the research showed that a regulated circadian rhythm, so a healthy 24-hour clock, is essential for a healthy gut lining, meaning if you have dysregulated circadian rhythms, you are more likely to have intestinal permeability, aka leaky gut. Dysregulation of your circadian rhythm will drive GI symptoms. So in theory, just by improving your body clock, by respecting the light-dark cycles and everything that we're going to discuss in the intervention part of today's webinar, that should lead to an improvement in gut symptoms. The gut microbiome is regulated by circadian rhythms, via intrinsic clocks that we've mentioned, the master clock in the brain and the peripheral clocks in all of our cells. Now, it's likely quite obvious that our microbiome is also regulated by the food, because we eat food, it travels through the digestive system, it gets broken down, and we're literally feeding the bugs some food as well. So our diet and everything that we just discussed in regards to the frequency at which we eat and the time that we eat, these are impacting both the structure of our gut microbiome, but also its metabolic activity. So what are these bugs actually doing within the gut? And that is arguably the most important thing when it comes to studying the gut microbiome. So we cannot have a healthy gut without a healthy circadian rhythm. And we can't really have a healthy circadian rhythm without a healthy gut. We've mentioned that all of these conditions associated with circadian rhythm dysfunction are bidirectional in nature. So just to emphasize this paper with this quote, modulation of these rhythms may be a potential therapeutic option for reducing symptom burden in these patients. These patients being people with disorders, is what they say in this paper, but imbalances in the gut-brain axis. Those with irritable bowel syndrome, which means those with small intestine bacterial overgrowth, those with sort of chronic dysbiosis, intestinal permeability, etc. Now, another way of thinking about the importance of circadian rhythm and optimal sleep for gut health is what we've already mentioned earlier very briefly, which is melatonin has been shown in supplement form, exogenous form, to be incredibly helpful for some people with chronic gut issues. Melatonin levels affect our microbiome, but also how our microbiome behaves. Many of you will be aware of butyrate. Butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid. It's something that some of our bacteria produce, and butyrate is the main food for the cells that line the colon. It also has immunomodulatory and anti-inflammatory properties, meaning it helps modulate our immune system. But also our gut bacteria modulate tryptophan, which is an amino acid that we get from food. And tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin and melatonin. So a healthy microbiome is important for the correct metabolism or modulation of tryptophan and therefore melatonin production. We cannot produce good levels of melatonin if we don't have a really healthy circadian rhythm. And we can't do these two things if we don't consider our light environment. We're going to come back to what we need to think about and how we can improve our light environments very soon. But not that long ago, I did a little bit of a deep dive into melatonin and look at all of the conditions associated with imbalances in melatonin production. Most of the conditions that are significantly on the rise in the modern world. One of the slides actually I should have added was a paper that came out quite recently, which was it was basically a map of the United States and looking at the United States at night and looking at the light pollution between something like 1950 and 2010, 2020. And it is scary to see the differences, as you would imagine. But the reason why I bring that up is because light pollution is a real fundamental issue to human and environmental health. Most of us are being exposed to so much artificial light at night, what often in the research they just shorten to ALAN, that this is having a profound impact on our melatonin levels and increasing our risk of all of these sorts of issues. We can also obviously think about, well, how do we make melatonin? Well, we need tryptophan. We've already mentioned that. We can consume melatonin-rich foods, things like certain types of cherries, for example. We can consider time-restricted feeding, which we've already kind of spoken about today, limiting the time that we actually consume food as a way to help entrain circadian rhythm. And then we've got other nutrients, zinc, omega-3, magnesium, various B vitamins that can all be helpful. Managing stress is very important for melatonin. We need to limit our blue light exposure, and we need to try and experience pitch darkness as much as we can. And actually, exposure to sunshine in the morning has been shown to increase melatonin production that night. So I have a saying, which I'm pretty sure I've taken from someone else who I forget now, so apologies to that person, but the quality of our sleep tonight was partly dictated by how we woke up this morning. Everything you do throughout your day is impacting your sleep tonight. It's not just that last hour or two in the evening that is going to impact it. And most of us just don't get that much sunshine in the morning. And we certainly don't get that infrared sunshine that we so desperately need, which I'm going to touch on soon as well. So with that in mind, how do we actually go about entraining our circadian rhythm? We've touched on some of this obviously already. We will go over a little bit and sort of go into a little bit more detail about some of these things. We're going to obviously add some new material as well. So time restricted feeding is a really interesting area of research. One approach for restoring optimal rhythm to our circadian biology is through feeding times, as we've discussed. Now, in one study, what they found was that participants who fasted for 14 to 15 hours each day for approximately a month had reduced levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. They basically had less inflammation in their bodies. Fasting for 14 to 15 hours a day, that does include overnight. So bear in mind that if we say that it's a 15-hour fast, then you've got 9 hours to consume your food, basically. So that would be, for example, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Obviously, that could become 7 till 3, for example. That sort of fasting period is anti-inflammatory and will have a really positive impact on circadian rhythm or circadian biology. Regular meal consumption can also be helpful because it's just another repetitive environmental stimulus for your clocks to be like, okay, it's breakfast again, which means it's 7 a.m. I know at 7 a.m. these biological, physiological processes need to peak. Consuming a higher proportion of energy early in the day. I always forget the actual saying. I should really memorize this, but that saying of, eat like a king or queen, etc. The idea of having a big breakfast, smaller lunch, and even smaller dinner is a genuine consideration. Reduce meal frequency. Try and have 2 or 3 meals a day. Don't have 3 meals and 3 snacks. That will potentially mean for some of you increasing the portion size of those meals. But I think it is far too easy for us to graze these days. As soon as we're bored or as soon as we get remotely hungry, we look for something to eat. One of the most powerful things I think we can honestly do for ourselves is to use a little bit of willpower and mindfulness as a way to focus on 3 meals a day. Regular fasting periods, obviously, as we've discussed, these are all really helpful at reducing inflammation, improving our rhythms, increasing autophagy, which is often described as a cellular housekeeping process. Autophagy is essential as a powerful anti-aging mechanism that our cells have. But it improves our stress resistance as well, and it helps modulate the gut microbiome. So many people naturally find out that when they fast, their gut symptoms improve. It kind of makes sense. You're not putting things into a system that is struggling. But if you do that consistently, it may actually help modulate the microbiome, which may help actually deal with the underlying issues that are contributing to the symptoms in the first place. In another paper, they did early time-restricted feeding, which is similar to that one point that we mentioned in the previous slide, which is basically restricting foods and putting it more early on in the day. This improves all sorts of cardiometabolic parameters and is anti-aging. Now, alcohol is always a tricky one because so many people use alcohol as a kind of sedative, as a way to go to sleep. The problem is it does not improve the actual quality of your sleep. This is a systematic review from memory that is cited here. And at all dosages, alcohol causes a reduction in sleep onset latency, a more consolidated first half sleep, and an increase in sleep disruption in the second half. So when you strap people up to actual machines that are monitoring the quality and depth of that sleep, that second half of sleep is significantly impacted. Limit caffeine. So this is personal, but caffeine typically prolongs sleep latency. Latency, if you don't know, is the rate at which you fall asleep. Caffeine reduces total sleep time, and it reduces the quality of that sleep. And I say this is all slightly personal because I do know people who swear by the fact if they actually have, I know someone who swears by having an espresso before bed. They wake up feeling better and they feel like they've slept better doing that. So these are, I would argue, general rules of thumbs for the majority of us. There are certainly outliers for all of these things, but the vast majority of people will know that caffeine is a problem. So I've put a question mark here, potentially avoid from lunch. You know, if you, like me, enjoy your morning caffeinated coffee, it's not a problem per se, but try and limit caffeine from lunchtime. Go to decaf as much as you can. Then we can look at exercise. And this is an interesting one because there is some pretty contradictory research, in all honesty. This paper discussed how the optimal timing of exercise is just not known at this point in time. And it's likely never going to be known as a generic recommendation because there are so many variables that are going to impact this. Health status of the individual, the circadian phenotype of the individual, meaning what is their natural constitution, what is their natural body clock? We're going to touch on that in a second. Modes and duration of exercise. High intensity exercise just before bed probably isn't a good idea, but a walk in the park is probably not going to have as much of an impact as a really basic example. Intensity of exercise and meal timing are all going to impact how exercise impacts health, but also sleep. So going back to this concept of phenotype, there's a term in the research called your chronotype. And there are basically two. This is the idea of, are you a morning person or an evening person? Sometimes people use this concept to as a way to ignore the fact that they're staying up till 2 a.m. If you're a sort of the late chronotype, that does not justify that lateness. We're talking about an hour, maybe 2 hour difference here, maximum. So late chronotypes, those who experience the most severe circadian misalignment, so these are the people that generally function better later in the day, may benefit from phase advances induced by exercise in the morning or evening. So what that means is research has shown that if you exercise in the morning, for example, it brings forward your sleep and your melatonin production and things like this. So it can be quite helpful. Evening exercise, however, can exacerbate the circadian misalignments in early chronotypes. I'm an early chronotype. My cognition, my energy, my ability to function as a human is pretty good in the mornings. It's terrible as the day goes on. It declines, and then sometimes, you know, I get to 3, 4 o'clock and I'm definitely past my best. And in the evenings, I'm just not very good cognitively. I can still obviously deliver a webinar and things, but I can feel I'm just working slower. Now, obviously, there's the nature-nurture element to this. This is a generalized concept. It's not that people who are an early chronotype aren't going to be able to shift that through behavior changes by starting to essentially do more work or activity later in the day. But there is genetic data around this. And then we've got this concept, and I really like this quote, comparing dietary interventions, the amplitude and extent of exercise training are likely to be greater in a head-to-head comparison. So these authors, and they may have a bit of a bias, obviously, but what they're saying here is that exercise may be more powerful, ultimately, when it comes to entraining circadian rhythm, or more importantly, cardiometabolic health. Evidence for such premise comes from observational research demonstrating that the association between low cardiometabolic fitness, i.e. how fit you are basically, and all-cause mortality is stronger than that of obesity. So if you are fit and obese, you're going to essentially be healthier or have healthier cardiometabolic parameters compared to someone who is unfit and obese, if that makes sense. So I thought that was actually just really interesting. Now combine the two together, exercise and time-restricted feeding, and you've got a really powerful combination there that is going to be really beneficial for many people. Exercise training delays the onset of at least 40 chronic metabolic conditions. We must consider our activity levels, and that does not mean going to the gym 3, 4, 5 times a week. A lot of us, and I know again, there are many limitations here for all of us, and I can put my hand up and say at times that I've been as guilty as anyone else, but doing an hour and a half in the gym 4 days a week, but being sedentary for 10 hours a day is still very problematic because it's a mismatch with how we have evolved. We are designed to move consistently throughout the day. So I encourage me and I encourage you to get up and move around as much as you can, even if it's going and getting a glass of water when you're in the office or going and getting a decaf coffee after lunch. Just look for reasons to get up, even if it's just a small walk to the kitchen or whatever it may be. Those micro movements throughout the day are going to make a big difference to your long-term health. So some of these things, when you're 60, 70, 80, hopefully 90, you're going to reap the rewards of. They're not necessarily going to change things next month for you, although some of them can, but they're absolutely going to have a profound impact on how you age over years. Interestingly, morning exercise enhanced parasympathetic activity, what people refer to as the rest and digest part of our nervous system. Evening exercise activated the sympathetic activity, which is the fight or flight response, put simply. So that is obviously going to have an impact on our sleep and our circadian rhythms. We also see in some really interesting experiments that have been done that if you put people into pitch black environments, but you get them exercising, the exercise can prevent otherwise unavoidable desynchronization of circadian rhythms, which is pretty powerful evidence to show us the power of exercise when it comes to this. So if we are a shift worker, for example, exercise may be a way for us to counteract some of the negative health consequences associated with shift work. But I want to finish by thinking about our light environment, because as you now know, this is the most powerful and most important environmental stimulus for healthy circadian rhythm. We know that using various apps or devices that block the blue light from our technology improves sleep in humans. So this means, for example, using an app such as Flux on your laptop. So I have Flux on my laptop now. It's on 24/7 on my laptop. and it helps block some of the blue light that is being emitted from my screen. So if I do have to do some evening work, or if I just have to work when the sun's gone down, which obviously in the UK in the winter months means from 4 o'clock or something like this, then it's really important for us to minimize our blue light exposure from quite early on in the day in the winter months. We can also wear things like blue light blocking glasses, which I'm going to touch on later on as well. So one of the most important things that we can all do is from sunset, limit our blue light exposure. So we can wear blue light blocking glasses. We can use filters like the Flux that I mentioned that you can download for free on your computers. You can change things in your settings on your phone to reduce blue light exposure as well. You can obviously just limit artificial light. So think about your bedside lamps, for example. Try and change whatever bulb you have and use an incandescent Edison style bulb. They don't flicker and they're a healthier form of light, put very simply. You can buy these types of bulbs at blockbluelight.co.uk. So ideally, all the bulbs you have in your house would be of this type, and Block Blue Light can help you understand the different type of bulbs that are out there and the light technology that is available. So if you just go to blockbluelight.co.uk, I think they've got 3 or 4 different types of bulbs. These, at least in your bedroom, potentially in the bathroom and maybe in the living room, you know, those areas of your home where you're spending time just before going to bed, that's where having these types of bulbs are going to really help with circadian rhythm. And obviously just limit technology to the best of your ability. You know, if you do want to watch a film or you're watching a TV series, then put on your blue light blocking glasses. You know, this is genuinely something that I do every single night if we're watching something, because we know it impacts the quality of our sleep. And you now know how important melatonin is for our health. You also know how important circadian rhythms are for our health as well. So these for me are foundational to good health. Also, especially in the winter months, if you're getting up before sunrise, in the ideal world, these are things that you would still consider. So you might put on your blue light blocking glasses when you're walking around the house, if you don't have these sorts of bulbs in particular, because then you're again training yourself to where the light is at that time of year. Because melatonin, we're going to be producing much more of it in the winter because we have longer dark periods. Melatonin, remember, is this powerful antioxidant that reduces our risk of all sorts of different conditions. So we really want to be maximizing the health properties of winter, which would be related to melatonin production. Now, I appreciate that not all of us can get outside at sunrise and at sunset. And I don't actually have a slide specifically on this, so I'm going to add it in here around red light therapy. You know, obviously, that at sunrise and sunset, the sky has a very distinct redness to it that it doesn't have at any other time of the day. And that is because at that time of day, infrared that is emitted from the sun is kind of almost at its peak compared to the other light spectrums of sunlight. So there's a recommendation of, to the best of your ability, getting outside at sunrise and sunset, and just what is referred to as sky gaze. A colleague of mine, Carrie Bennett, is just an absolute expert and genius in this area of health. I recommend, if you're on social media, giving her a search, Carrie Bennett. Listen to the podcast that I've done with her. Her knowledge in this area is pretty much, I think, second to none. And she has this term of eye gazing. So look to the east at sunrise and just look up at the sky, look at the brightest point. And even if you can only do it for a minute or two, if you can get into the habit of doing that as consistently as possible, it really can significantly improve your health. And it's something that I started doing maybe, I'm going to say 4 or 5 months ago. It might actually be a little bit longer. And it did make a noticeable improvement to my energy. Even getting up that early Obviously in the summer in the UK, you've got to get up very early to see sunrise. For those of you that don't know, I have at the moment a 17-month-old son. So at times I was up at 4:30 anyway. So I was taking that opportunity to see the sunrise. And it was very surprising at how things started to change for me. I started to be just increasingly aware of how I felt when I was in natural sunlight compared to artificial light, or just inside compared to outside. And I really tried to look for every opportunity I could to get outside, because I was just feeling so much better. And I generally felt like my battery was charging by being outside at sunrise and sunset. And I promise that if you were able to give this a go for a period of time, that you will notice the benefits. The good news as we go into autumn is it's much easier, obviously, to be outside at sunrise now. Red light therapy is a modern way that we can do this inside, is a way to think about it. So you can buy infrared light or lamps, and the research on this is just jaw-dropping. So this is just one quote from one paper, but changes in the human microbiome occur after treatment with photobiomodulation, light therapy, using an infrared lamp, for example. Those of you that have done a gut test for us, for example, will be familiar with some of these bacteria: Akkermansia, Bifidobacterium, Faecalibacterium. Akkermansia and Faecalibacterium are described as two of the keystone species of our microbiome, meaning that they are incredibly important, put simply. And shining an infrared lamp at your tummy for 10, 15 minutes, 3-4 days a week has actually been shown to increase the numbers of these organisms. That shows us that even the bacteria residing in our intestine are influenced by sunlight. This isn't that surprising when you go and look at some of the research and think about how we've evolved on this planet. We are only here because of the distance we are away from the sun. Sun and light is what has given life to this planet. It's really, I think, absolutely fascinating. So photobiomodulation, red light therapy, there are various companies out there. I've recently was recommended this company. It's the lamp that I have. It's the one that I recommend to clients. We've been able to get a 20% discount for you by going to their websites. If you just Google emrtech.com, you will come up there. And they have, in my opinion, the best quality product at this point in time. It gets very technical in regards to what you need to be looking for. But colleagues of mine have recommended this product, and those colleagues specialize in that area. So this is the one that we now recommend. It comes with instructions, but the general principle is you can use it to mimic sunrise and sunset. It comes with 2 settings, a slightly weaker setting, a slightly more powerful setting. And in some ways, there are 2 ways that you can use these devices. You can use it as just a lamp, meaning it could be on as a stand in the corner, and you can have it on while you have your breakfast, make your coffee, watch TV, whatever it may be. The more powerful setting, you can actually put sort of 12 to 15 inches away from specific parts of your body, and it has specific benefits to those organs or tissues. So sometimes people use it with recovery from exercise. There's research showing it can be helpful with neurological health, things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. It's been shown to improve thyroid function and reduce thyroid antibodies in those with Hashimoto's, which is a thyroid autoimmune condition. So these are really powerful research studies showing us the power of light therapy. And we've known about this for decades. It just, for some reason, is only just kind of catching on ultimately. Maybe that's partly related to technological advances as well. So a summary, we need to spend time outside, ideally in the morning around sunrise, but it can be sunset. But ultimately, spending more time outside is going to be the most important thing that we can consider here. Practice some time-restricted feeding. Focus having more calories earlier on in your day. potentially exercise earlier in the day, but this is going to be very variable. And I also appreciate that for most of us, we're either going to have to exercise before work or after work. You know, we don't have that many options there. Maybe experiment. Maybe it just has to fluctuate based on the rest of your schedule. But I would definitely say avoid high intensity exercise in the evenings. You know, don't go and do a spin class at 8 p.m. It really doesn't make sense. So you may need to, if you're wanting to really optimize health and circadian rhythms, you may need to let go of some of the things that you enjoy. There's got to be a balance there ultimately. Limit alcohol and caffeine, limit artificial night at light, consider ways that you can manage that either through blue light blocking glasses or some of the filters that we've mentioned for technology. Think about the bulbs that you have in your home and establish an evening routine. I think of this as, you know, another environmental stimuli to tell your mind and body that it's time to unwind. This could be a chamomile tea that you have at the same time every evening, 9 p.m. You turn the kettle on. The aromas of the tea, the taste of the chamomile are all going to be signs that it's time that in an hour you're kind of lights out and in bed. So thank you for listening.